Again, my name is Zach Alexander, and I'm a co-CEO of LUX MACHINA Consulting, which is now part of the NEP group. So today, I'm going to go over a brief history of who we are, kind of our journey through IC VFX and virtual production, and then I'll go into a little bit of a deeper dive with the League of Legends World Semifinals that we did in October of 2020, which actually just won an AV award for the Broadcast Media Project of the Year. So let's get started. So who we are. So Lux Machina is a group of bold industry explorers, nerdy system architects, and seasoned expert technologists. We were formed in 2013, and we originally, most of the work that we did was for design and operation for large-scale video playback systems for things like live broadcast, which would be like the Oscars, the Grammys, the Emmys, that sort of thing, or large corporate events like Google Next I/O, Salesforce Dreamforce, events kind of like that. But more recently, and pretty immediately after we were formed, we'd kind of jumped into the world of film, where we've primarily done IC VFX and virtual production. So IC VFX stands for in-camera visual effects, and it's basically an evolution of old school special effects like rear screen projection, but it incorporates new technology that largely comes from the world of live events. And then what we're calling virtual production kind of incorporates these IC VFX techniques while using a whole host of other tools that include things like camera tracking, photogrammetry, and simulcam. So kind of taking us through this whole sort of process, the first big film project that I was involved in was in 2011 on the movie Oblivion. This was sort of like our big first IC VFX project, and we were essentially taking all of the learnings that we had from the broadcast work we did and then bringing that into the film world. So this particular setup that you can kind of see on the left here was 21 20K projectors on a 270-degree screen. And then we had just straight playback with plates, so there was no kind of 3D element to it. But we would change the backgrounds and for the different scenes. And with that, you got a lot of really nice reflections because most of the actual set was made of like chrome metal. And if we didn't have these projections, you would actually have to go in and post and either add them or just forget them, about them altogether. So in this project, we were sort of bringing the multi-screen control work that we had done on these award shows and then bringing that to film. So it was, syncing multiple outputs, syncing cameras, adding some level of color control for the director of photography, so on and so forth. Jumping ahead a little bit, we get straight to actually Solo, a Star Wars story in 2017. So for us, this kind of is another marker for like the next step of the work that we did, in that we were now tuning cameras to the display device. So in this particular one, again, we were on projection. Again, it was sort of like a big wraparound screen. But what we actually did was worked with a color scientist from Industrial Light and Magic, and we formed a lookup table or a LUT that we actually loaded into the projectors so they would match, they would be more sensitive to the particular colors that the camera was sensitive to. So what I kind of mean by this is that if you're looking at like a projection screen or an LED wall through an uncalibrated camera, it'll look like a projection or an LED wall. So like if you had a projection of an apple on the screen and a real apple in your hand, the colors would be slightly off. And I mean, that's because one of them is clearly a projection and one of them is a real thing. So one of them is light bouncing off of a projection screen and the other is just light coming off of a physical object. So what we try to do with the lookup tables is sort of tweak the video signal to kind of make the video signal look more like the real world to that specific camera. And different cameras are slightly different in terms of what wavelengths of light they're sensitive to. So it's a process that is different for every model of camera, and it's also different depending on what lenses and things you actually have in the camera itself. So The other thing that we sort of implemented at a large scale on Solo was sort of our show control elements. So we had some pretty fun things where if you were in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon, you could actually push a lever and the whole ship would go into hyperspace. And so besides being just really fun to do, this was sort of like an interactive experience for the actors and the director. And we could actually give little controls to like the director or the director of photography so they could trigger these events right when they needed to at particular parts of the of a shot. The next one I kind of want to touch on a little bit was is Top Gun 2, which we filmed in 2018 but has not been actually released yet. And before I go any further, if you see that movie, all of the shots inside the jets are completely real. They actually got into real fighter jets and flew around and shot them. The thing that we worked on that was a very small portion of it, and it was really just this control tower for a couple scenes. The reason they had to do this control tower is because the real control tower was actually on a real military base. So they had no control over when planes would fly by, which was kind of like horrible for audio. So they built this whole control tower in a different set, and we again surrounded it with projectors and use it to fake outside. The big thing for us on this particular project is we started using machine learning for our projection focusing and calibration. So we had like machine vision cameras that we set up, and they would, we would project a test grid kind of over the whole screen, and then the system would actually automatically warp the image to make it look correct. And then we'd do a few minor tweaks, calibrate the color, and then so we were kind of off to go. But this was kind of our first foray into using like machine learning techniques, as well as using like, laser projectors, which are just even brighter than kind of the normal ones we were using on Oblivion. And we were actually able to do the same number of projectors that we used in 2011 for Oblivion, but it took us half the time to kind of get everything sort of set up. So this brings us then to 2019 and The Mandalorian and season 1 of that. So this for us was our first big integration of game engine technology at scale for shooting. We had used sort of game engine render machines before in sort of smaller capacities. Like there's a kind of a real-time engine called Notch, which we've used for doing kind of some real-time color effects and things like that, but never as part of the actual thing that was playing back the content. So with this Unreal 4 pipeline integration, we had real-time rendering. We were kind of the ones who were managing the signal from the computers that Epic and ILM were using, and then making sure that the color pipeline and the scaling and the sync was all kind of maintained as it moved out to the LED wall itself. So this added things like camera tracking for us. There was some set extension blending that was done in kind of post. But the big thing is that we were figuring out kind of with Epic and ILM how to use a game engine that was originally designed to be used like on a single 4K monitor to be used, across, I think it was like 16K worth of LED at this point. So it was a challenge of scale in a lot of ways. So kind of after our first foray into that, and the thing I wanted to kind of talk to you about today, because it kind of gets even more complicated, is the League of Legends semifinals that were in 2020. And this one was interesting for us because the original plan for this part of the semifinals was for all of these to sort of take place in different arenas all over China. But because of COVID, they kind of condensed all the semifinals into one room, and then they had the finals in kind of a neighboring arena. We were working with a content company called Possible Productions, who does a lot of the content for these types of events. And what they had been working with Riot was to try to figure out a way to make this an even more like dynamic and interesting sort of event, even though it was sort of constrained by size. So this was shot in Shanghai. This was sort of like taking everything we had learned from Mandalorian, which is done, on a set and then, edited in post, and trying to translate that into a real-time broadcast experience. So in Mandalorian, if the UE4 system crashed, you could just, call cut, reboot the computers, and then start up again. We don't have that option when you're live on camera. So we had to make sure that everything was bulletproof, super solid, and just really thought out. So where this started for us is the actual shape of the LED wall itself. And basically the stage, it was in a ballroom in a hotel in Shanghai. So we didn't have very high ceilings in comparison to like an arena or like an actual stage. And what it ended up being was a rectangle of LED with an LED floor, and it was 16.5 meters wide, 17 meters deep, and then about 4.5 meters tall. Usually, when we make these types of volumes, we try to do a giant curved wall. And the reason for that is that the best angle for a camera facing an actual LED wall is for it to be perpendicular. So the camera's facing straight at the flat piece of wall. It gives you the best color representation, and it's how those walls are designed to be looked at is dead on. What happens then is that as you move the camera, the LED will kind of look okay as you kind of come off axis, but at a certain point, you're sort of looking off this side and you'll start to see color shift in the LED wall. So what we try to do is we try to curve the LED wall so that as you move the camera around, you're sort of always facing a flat piece of the wall, if that makes sense. So in this case, though, because we were in a ballroom and we had kind of constricted space, the goal was to give ourselves as big of an area that we could possibly get, right? So we wanted to really push the LED to the ends of the walls, which is how we kind of got to this square thing. The other thing that we had to deal with was the LED floor. So if we were doing this on a stage that had more ceiling space, what we would probably do is actually lower the walls on top of the floor so we could get the curved wall and really sort of fit it in there. Because we didn't have that space and everything kind of had to be ground supported as far as the LED went, what we were really just trying to do was press the LED as close to the floor as possible to get the least amount of seams and to get everything as tight as possible. So the other kind of things to point out on this drawing too is this kind of, if you can see my mouse, this stripe right here at the top is actually a physical set piece. It's not content. And what that is there for is to kind of frame the space, but it also helps us hide the transition between the LED wall down here into the AR scene extension that we have up here. Because at the top, there's a whole lighting rig and where all the sensors for the camera tracking sort of sat. So, but we'd have to replace that in real time to kind of hide that. So let me kind of jump into the LED a little bit here. We used row black pearl for the walls and black marble, row black marble for the floor. So it was a 2.8 millimeter product for the walls, which means the LEDs were 2.8 millimeters apart, and the black marble is a 5 millimeter floor LED. There was about 1,702 of these tiles, and they were all running off of Brompton processors. Basically, these tiles were chosen just for their ability to sync well with the cameras. Also, they are chosen. They have good viewing angles. They have a pretty decent color depth and contrast ratio that you can get out of them. And we used them a number of times before on other projects, so we kind of knew what we were working with. The second big element of this was the camera tracking. And the camera tracking can get a little tricky, but the camera tracking is the thing that turns this into just being a bunch of 2D plates being played back on screens into a really 3D immersive experience without the and like a true virtual production sort of pipeline. Because without the camera tracking, you can't do the perspective correction on the camera. You can't do AR additions very easily, and you can't do scene extensions. So it's a huge part of what sort of kicks this up from just being, pretty pictures being put on a projection or an LED wall. For this particular project, we had 2 handhelds, 1 Steadicam and 1 jib. We used for the camera tracking on this one 4 Stipe Red Spies, which are it's basically camera-mounted IR cameras that look for IR reflective stickers that you place on a surface. So in this case, they were on the lighting rig, and that's sort of how you track them. And then the Red Stipe systems also had lens encoders to get the fizz data back to Unreal. Fizz is focus, focus, iris, and zoom information on the lens. So all of that was sort of being pumped back to the Unreal system. The big challenge with the camera tracking is that we had multiple cameras. So what ends up happening is when we have our Unreal level that's sitting there and has like all of the content, when the LEDs are displaying content, there's sort of 2 major elements. There's what we call the inner frustum and the outer frustum. And the outer frustum is essentially just a fixed perspective of what you would see in that 3D world if you were just sort of like looking, using the LED wall as a window and just looking straight out, right? So it looks kind of like traditional playback. The image doesn't have any perspective correction in it. It's sort of just sitting there. It could be animated and doing its thing, but it's not correcting for perspective. And what that is for is to give us a lot of our reflections and sort of our interactive light, sort of just as like a base, but you're never really looking at it. The inner frustum is what is actually on the cameras, is what's being tracked by the cameras themselves. So in engine, there is a virtual camera that is matched in like positional space with a real camera. So when you move the real camera, the virtual camera moves. And whatever the virtual camera sees is projected as this sort of like mini viewport that's like in the middle of these frustum kind of beams right here between these pink lines. And that's lined up exactly with what the real camera can see. So what you're doing is you're projecting on the LED wall the view that the virtual camera is seeing for the real camera. And so that's the thing that when you kind of move it around, it shifts the perspective. And I think I actually have my next slide here shows that sort of in action. So you can see that the inner frustum is the part that's moving here. And then the outer frustum is sort of everything out here outside of the inner frustum that is sort of sitting and just providing extra light. The trick with this, though, is that if you have 2 cameras, they can't really look in the same place because one of those inner frustums has to be on top of the other. So what we had to do for this particular project was we actually had, we were accepting signals from the camera switcher, and so every time they switched which camera they were looking at, that camera's inner frustum would pop on and the other ones would turn off. And so we had to add a little bit of delay to kind of compensate for that, but that's sort of how we solved the problem. There's some interesting new technology called ghost framing now that can kind of enable you to have 2 cameras looking at the same thing at the same time. And it's sort of like you sync the playback to each of the cameras, so they're actually each seeing a different type of video, but we didn't have that technology during this time. So that's sort of how we handled it, was with the timing the frustums with the switching. Kind of moving forward here, I have an example of how the whole thing sort of like fit together. And what you're looking at here is 4 camera shots of the same sort of footage. So camera 11 over here is the AR. So this is all of the in-game content. So this is what you would be seeing in the Unreal Engine. C12 here is the foreground pieces. So this is the stuff that would be in the volume and sort of like the actual AR element that we're going to comp into the live camera feed. Over here on a C16, you're seeing the live footage. You can see because there's no ceiling up here. It's just the hole. And then you're seeing the AR, but it's not really being comped in. It's just sort of being laid on top. That's why if you look closely, he's actually on top of the bits. Like they're actually in front of the AR. So here is the final rendered shot. And again, this is all happening in real time. If you look through the camera, this is what you would see. So you can see him here, and now these pieces are actually behind the proper actors and in front of others, depending on what they're supposed to be. And you can also see up here at the top, there's sort of the extension to the world where we've kind of replaced the ceiling with actual content from the engine. So this last slide here is kind of, again, showing the whole thing. It's a really nice A/B comparison of what we were doing in real time here. What you're seeing here, too, is an interaction with the actual League of Legends game server, where what's happening is this player here on the left, he's choosing this character in the game. And Riot has an API for their League of Legends game where they can actually send data out of it to entertainment vendors like ourselves. So when the player selects a particular character, we can actually trigger an event on our side that then is timed with that. So none of this was like someone sitting there hitting a button when they chose it. This was actually taking data from the game and then triggering an event in our version of things. So at the end of the day, this particular project was sort of pretty impressive for us because we ended up being live on air for 240 hours over the course of October of that year. And we had no on-air crashes, so the thing was stable the entire time. We were managing over 12,500 camera cuts. There was 7.8 million OSC messages being sent back and forth between Unreal, the game, and like some of the lighting elements to it. And we rendered about 52 million frames at 5994 FPS for the whole thing. So all in all, it was an incredibly involved process, and clearly technically challenging, especially because all of this was live. So again, it had to be stable the entire time it was on air. But ultimately, I think the effect turned out really cool, and it was a great success. So that kind of brings me to the future of virtual production for us. And at LUX Machina, some of the things that we're doing is we're trying to establish these workflows. Like when we were working on Oblivion, there were other folks who were doing that type of work with large-scale projectors and LEDs and stuff like that, but it was sort of around 2011, it wasn't being widely used. Green screen was kind of more in vogue at the time. And over the next 4 years, we sort of were kind of looking back to the old ways that they had done this work and kind of reinventing things, making things easier to do. And others were doing that as well and getting more familiar. So by 2015, let's call it, using LEDs or projection for background was kind of something that, again, was used pretty regularly. So when we did Mandalorian at the end of 2019, we were kind of anticipating that there would be another kind of 4 years of slow adoption, right? So it would be used for Mandalorian. You'd probably see it pop up for scenes on other shows. Lucasfilm would probably use it for other tools, but it would be something that was sort of picked at and just kind of slowly become part of the filmmaking workflow. But with COVID, all of that 4 years got compressed into about 4 months. So when we were all in lockdown, everyone kind of looked around and said, well, how can I film without having to like actually be on location? And they kind of looked at us and Mandalorian and said, ooh, why don't we do that? So a lot of the challenge right now is that this stuff is sort of still being invented, figured out. There hasn't been that time of really testing and standardization that we would like to see. And that's no one's fault. It's just the fact that like it's all happening so fast. So one of the big things that we're trying to do is we're starting to build our own volumes that we manage that can be accessible to all types of filmmakers, not just those with huge budgets. The idea is that there's versions of these techniques that can be used by anybody, and that we want to make it accessible, and we want to make it just another tool in a filmmaker's toolbox for doing this type of work. And really for us, the big thing is that the creativity has to drive the technology. You don't use one of these techniques just because you want to do a new technique. You use it because it helps you further the story. And that's really important for us. So continuing to educate filmmakers on how they use this technology is something that we're doing. I mean, that's partially why I'm here. And, there will always be better advancements in hardware and processing. But again, we're on kind of a mission to have a standard that everyone can build up from. So that's pretty much concludes my talk. Thank you so much for having me. And I think after the next presentation, I will be back for other questions.